I sold my house. I gave away my furniture to neighbors I'd known for 30 years. I said goodbye to every friend I had left in this world, because my daughter called me crying, begging me to come live with her in America, promising she would take care of me for the rest of my life. 8 months later, she stood in front of her own dinner guests and told me to go back to India, and this time, never come back. I packed my suitcases before sunrise the next morning. I didn't even say goodbye to my own grandson, because I knew if I looked at his face one more time, I wouldn't have the strength to leave. For 8 months, I heard nothing, not a single phone call, not one message. I rebuilt a life for myself, quietly, 3,000 miles away, believing I would never hear my daughter's voice again. And then, exactly 8 months later, my phone started ringing, again and again and again. What I didn't know yet was that everything my daughter had built, her marriage, her career, the perfect American life she'd humiliated me to protect, was falling apart. And the only person who could save what was left of it was the mother she told to never come home. This is my story. My name doesn't matter yet. What matters is that I buried my husband on a Tuesday, and by Thursday, the house felt so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat at night. That is the kind of silence that teaches you things about yourself you never wanted to know. I was 64 years old, a retired school teacher living in Mysuru, in the south of India, in the same house I had lived in for more than 30 years. My husband and I had raised our only daughter within those walls. We had painted them together, argued over the color of the curtains, celebrated every festival with the neighbors gathered on our veranda. And then cancer took him, slowly, over 18 months, until one morning he simply stopped breathing while I was holding his hand. After that, I moved through my days like a ghost haunting her own life. I would set 2 cups of tea out of habit before remembering there was only one person to drink it. I would talk to him out loud sometimes, just to hear a voice in the house, even if it was only my own. My daughter, Ishani, called me every Sunday from Texas. She had moved to the United States almost 20 years earlier for graduate studies, married an Indian-American man she met there, and eventually became a citizen herself. She had built a life so far from mine that sometimes it felt like she belonged to a different world entirely. But she was still my daughter, and when she called that particular Sunday, 3 weeks after the funeral, her voice cracked in a way I hadn't heard since she was a little girl. "Amma," she said, "I can't stand the thought of you alone in that house. I want you here, with me. I'll take care of everything." I remember sitting on the edge of my bed, phone pressed hard against my ear, feeling something crack open in my chest. For weeks, I had felt like a burden to the universe itself, like a woman whose purpose had quietly expired. And here was my only child, telling me she needed me, that she wanted to build a family around me again. I said yes before she even finished explaining the details. What followed was months of paperwork. Ishani handled it all with the efficiency she was known for at her job. She worked as a project manager for a technology company in Plano, a fast-growing city just north of Dallas. She filed the petition for me to come to the United States as the parent of a citizen. She sent documents, translated certificates, filled out forms I didn't understand, and called immigration offices during her lunch breaks. Every conversation we had during that time ended with her saying the same thing. "Don't worry, Amma. I'm handling everything. You just have to pack." Pack. As if 30 years of a life could fit into suitcases. I sold the house first. It was harder than I expected. Not the transaction itself, but standing in each room one last time, remembering where the furniture used to sit before we rearranged it for my daughter's wedding reception, remembering the exact spot in the kitchen where my husband used to stand and complain that I put too much cumin in the sambar. I gave away most of our furniture to the neighbors who had known us for decades. The Krishnamurthis took our dining table. The young couple 2 houses down took my husband's old reading chair, the one with the worn armrest where his elbow used to rest for hours while he read the newspaper. I said goodbye to my closest friends over one long evening of tea and old photographs. Lakshmi, who had known me since we were both new brides in this neighborhood, held my hands and said, "You are so lucky, Vasudha. Not every mother gets called back by her children like this." I remember smiling and believing her completely. I boarded the flight with 2 suitcases and a heart full of something I hadn't felt in over a year: hope. When I arrived in Texas, Ishani was waiting at the airport with her husband, Arjun, and my grandson, little Arav, who was 5 years old and shy around this grandmother he barely knew. Ishani hugged me so tightly at the arrivals gate that I nearly lost my balance. "You're home now, Amma," she whispered into my ear. "You never have to go back to being alone again." Those first months felt like something out of a dream I didn't know I was allowed to have anymore. I woke early every morning and made idlis and dosas for the family before Ishani left for work. I walked Arav to the school bus stop, holding his small hand in mine, learning the names of the other children in the neighborhood, learning which houses had dogs that barked and which had gardens I could admire on our walk. I picked him up in the afternoons, and slowly, the shy little boy who once hid behind his mother's legs started running toward me at pickup time, shouting, "Aji, Aji," the word for grandmother in Canada, our language. I learned the rhythms of a very different life. I learned that the mail arrived once a day and not twice like at home. I learned which grocery store carried the spices I needed and which ones didn't. I learned to navigate a strange, quiet suburban street where nobody sat outside on their porches in the evening the way we did back home, where you could walk for 20 minutes and not see another human face on foot. But none of that mattered, because in the evenings, when Ishani came home from work, we would sit together in the kitchen while I cooked, and she would tell me about her day, about her colleagues, about the pressures of her job. For the first time since her father's death, I felt like I mattered to someone. I felt like a mother again, not just a widow occupying space in an empty house. I remember thinking during those early months that grief had a strange way of resolving itself. I had lost a husband, but I had gained, in some ways, a fuller relationship with my daughter than we'd had in years. A closeness that distance and her busy American life had slowly eroded over 2 decades. I told myself I had been given a second chapter I didn't deserve, and I intended to be grateful for every single day of it. I didn't yet understand that Ishani's world was made of more than just her family. I didn't understand the pressure she was under at work, the image she felt she needed to maintain among her colleagues and her husband's business associates, the quiet embarrassment that can grow in someone's heart even toward the people they love most, especially when that person feels caught between 2 identities, the daughter of a traditional Indian mother and the polished American professional she had worked so hard to become. I didn't see it happening because I didn't want to see it. I was too busy being grateful, too busy believing that this, the kitchen, the grandson, the evenings with my daughter, was permanent. I had no idea that within a matter of months, the same woman who begged me to come to America, who promised she would take care of me forever, would stand in front of a room full of her colleagues and say words to me that I still cannot fully repeat without my hands beginning to shake. I had no idea that the home I had given up everything for would become, once again, a place where I did not belong. But that is getting ahead of the story. Right now, in this part of my life, I was still a woman who believed, fully and completely, that she had finally found her way back home. The first crack appeared so quietly that I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. It was a Tuesday evening, about 4 months after I arrived in Texas. Ishani had been promoted at her company, a role that put her in regular contact with senior leadership, people whose names she said with a kind of reverence I had never heard in her voice before. She started coming home later. She started taking phone calls in the bedroom with the door closed. She started talking about networking events and client dinners, the way some people talk about religious obligations, necessary, unavoidable, and slightly exhausting. One evening, she came home and found me in the kitchen wearing my usual cotton sari, stirring a pot of rasam, the smell of tamarind and pepper filling the house. She stood in the doorway for a moment longer than usual, and something in her expression made me turn around. "Amma," she said carefully, "do you think, maybe, when people come over, you could wear something a little more simple? Maybe the clothes I bought you?" She had, in fact, bought me a small collection of Western-style clothes shortly after I arrived. Soft cardigans, plain trousers, blouses in muted colors. I had worn them a handful of times to please her, but I always returned to my saris because they were comfortable, because they were mine, because wearing them made me feel like myself in a country where so little else did. I told her I didn't understand. Nobody had complained. Nobody had said anything. "It's not that anyone said anything," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. It's just, some of my colleagues are coming for dinner on Friday. I just want everything to feel a little more polished. Polished. I turned the word over in my mind for days afterward. I wore the cardigan on Friday. I said very little at the dinner table. When one of her colleagues, a friendly enough woman named Denise, asked me questions about India, I answered in short sentences, careful with my English, watching Ishani's face out of the corner of my eye for any sign of embarrassment. I found myself editing my own thoughts before they left my mouth, the way you might edit a letter you're worried will be read by the wrong person. That was the beginning of a pattern I did not have a name for yet. Over the following weeks, I noticed small things accumulate like dust in corners nobody bothers to clean. Ishani stopped inviting me to certain gatherings, not family events, but the ones connected to her work, the fundraisers and the holiday parties. When I asked once why I wasn't included in a colleague's engagement party, she said quickly, "It's just going to be really loud and late, Amma. You'd be bored." I accepted this explanation because I wanted to. She began correcting the way I spoke English in front of Arav's teachers at school pickup, gently but firmly, as though my accent were something that needed managing rather than simply a part of who I was. She asked me not to speak Kannada to Arav when other parents were around. Worried, she said, that it might confuse him, though he had never once seemed confused. Only delighted, the way children are delighted by having a secret language with someone they love. I tried to talk to Arjun about it once, hoping he might help me understand what was happening to his wife, my daughter. He was a kind man, quieter than Ishani, and he listened patiently as I described my confusion. "She's under a lot of pressure at work," he said finally. "There's a promotion coming up, a bigger one. She wants to make partner-level status in the company. I think she's just trying to control everything she can control right now." I wouldn't take it personally. Amma. I wanted to believe him. I told myself that success sometimes makes people strange, that ambition has its own gravity, pulling a person's attention toward things that seem urgent even when they are not truly important. I told myself this was temporary, a phase, something that would pass once she settled into her new position. But the criticisms continued, and they grew sharper. She corrected the way I cooked, asking me to use less oil, less spice, because her colleagues weren't used to that kind of food when they occasionally stopped by. She asked me to keep my prayer altar, the small shrine I had set up in the corner of my room with pictures of Lord Venkateswara and a few flowers I replaced every few days, hidden from view whenever guests visited, worried it might seem too much to people unfamiliar with our customs. Each request was small enough on its own that objecting felt petty, even ungrateful. I reminded myself again and again that I owed her everything: my home in this country, my closeness to my grandson, my rescue from a life of solitary grief. How could I complain about a sari, a spice, a shrine, when she had given me back a family? So I folded myself smaller. I wore the cardigans more often. I cooked blander food when guests were expected. I moved my prayer photographs to a drawer I could open in private. I became, without fully realizing it, a smaller version of myself, shaped to fit into corners where I would not be noticed, would not embarrass anyone, would not remind my daughter's polished new world that she had come from somewhere else entirely. Arav was the one bright constant through all of this. He didn't care about polish or accents or what his mother's colleagues might think. He wanted stories about gods and demons before bed, wanted to learn the names of vegetables in Canada, wanted his grandmother to hold his hand on the walk to school even as he got older and his friends began walking alone. In him, I found the same unguarded love I had once given so freely to my own daughter. Before the world had taught her to be careful about who she let people see, I threw myself into being his grandmother the way I had once thrown myself into being Ishani's mother, completely, without reservation, without asking for anything in return except his laughter and his small hand in mine. Looking back now, I think I sensed something was building even then. Some pressure accumulating beneath the surface of our lives that would eventually need somewhere to go. I felt it the way you feel a storm coming before the sky actually darkens. A heaviness in the air, a stillness that isn't quite peace. I didn't know it would arrive on a Saturday evening in November, during a dinner Ishani had been planning for nearly 2 weeks. A dinner meant to impress the very people whose opinions had come to matter more to my daughter than her own mother's dignity. I didn't know that the small compromises I had made, the cardigans, the blander food, the hidden shrine, the careful English, had not been enough to satisfy whatever fear was growing inside Ishani. I didn't know they would never be enough. I didn't know that in a matter of weeks, I would be standing in a doorway of a house I no longer felt welcome in, packing 2 suitcases for the second time in less than a year, listening to words from my own daughter's mouth that would follow me across an ocean and settle permanently into the deepest part of my chest. But that evening, watching Arav sleep after his bedtime story, I still believed we could find our way back to the closeness we'd had in those first hopeful months. I still believed love was enough to smooth over any misunderstanding. I did not yet understand what fear does to a person's love, how it can hollow it out from the inside while leaving the shape perfectly intact, so that you don't notice anything is missing until the moment it collapses entirely. That moment was closer than I knew. The dinner was set for a Saturday evening in November, and Ishani had been preparing for nearly 2 weeks as though the fate of her entire career rested on that single night. Her manager was coming, along with 3 senior colleagues and their spouses, people whose names she mentioned with a strange mixture of admiration and anxiety, as though she were speaking about royalty rather than co-workers. She cleaned the house herself, top to bottom, though we already had a cleaning service that came every other week. She rearranged the furniture in the living room twice. She asked me 3 separate times to confirm what I would be cooking, and each time I told her, she found some small reason to adjust the menu. Less spice here, a simpler dish there, nothing too foreign, as she put it, for people who had never eaten Indian food beyond what they ordered from a restaurant menu. On the morning of the dinner, she came to my room while I was getting dressed and asked, gently but firmly, if I would wear the pale blue cardigan and the gray trousers she had set out for me the night before. I looked at the outfit laid across my bed like a costume for a role I hadn't auditioned for, and something in me wanted to refuse. But I thought of Arjun's words. She's under a lot of pressure, and I told myself, once more, that this single evening of compromise was a small price for the family I had been given back. I wore the cardigan. The guests arrived a little after 7 in the evening. I greeted each of them politely, offered them drinks, retreated to the kitchen to finish the final dishes while Ishani entertained in the living room, her laugh sounding brighter and louder than I had heard it in months, almost desperate in its cheerfulness. Dinner itself went smoothly at first. The guests complimented the food, careful and polite in the way people are when trying a cuisine unfamiliar to them. Arav sat beside me, happily eating, occasionally whispering questions to me in Canada about who these strangers were and when they would leave so he could watch his cartoons. I answered him quietly in our language, the way I always did, without thinking twice about it, because it was simply how we spoke to each other. It was during dessert that everything changed. One of the guests, a woman named Patricia who worked closely with Ishani, asked pleasantly, "Is that Hindi you're speaking with your grandson? It's such a beautiful language." I opened my mouth to explain gently that it was actually Kannada, a different language altogether from Hindi, spoken in the state I came from, and that India had many languages, not just one. It was an innocent correction, the kind I had made countless times before to curious Americans who assumed all of India spoke the same tongue. But before I could finish my sentence, Ishani cut in sharply, correcting me instead, telling Patricia that, yes, it was simply an Indian dialect, waving her hand dismissively as though the distinction didn't matter, as though 30 years of my life spent teaching literature in that very language was a footnote not worth mentioning at her dinner table. I felt something small crack inside me, but I said nothing. I smiled instead, the way I had trained myself to do over the past months, and reached for Arav's empty plate to carry to the kitchen. It was in the kitchen, a few minutes later, that Arav came running in, tugging at my cardigan, asking in Canada if he could have another piece of the sweet I had made. I answered him in Canada, as I always did, without thinking, without any awareness that Ishani had followed him into the doorway and was standing there, watching us, her face suddenly tight in a way I had never seen before. "Amma," she said, her voice low but sharp enough to cut. "I told you. English, please, not in front of everyone." I looked at her, confused, still holding the small plate in my hands. "He asked me in Canada, Ishani. I only answered him the way he spoke to me." "It doesn't matter," she said, her voice rising slightly now, loud enough that I noticed one of the guests glance toward the kitchen doorway. "Everyone can hear you. Do you understand how that looks? Speaking some village language in front of my manager, in front of people I have to work with every single day." The word village landed in my chest like a stone dropped into still water. I set the plate down carefully on the counter, my hands trembling slightly, and I asked her, as calmly as I could manage, to please lower her voice, to remember that we had guests, that this was not the place for this conversation. But something in Ishani had already broken loose, some dam that had been straining under pressure for months, and my request for calm only seemed to release it entirely. "You embarrass me," she said, her voice no longer low at all, carrying clearly into the dining room where I could see, out of the corner of my eye, the guests falling into an uncomfortable, frozen silence. "Every single day you embarrass me. The clothes, the food, the language. I have asked you again and again to just try, and you refuse. Do you know what people think when they see you? Do you know what they say about immigrant families like ours?" I stood very still, feeling the eyes of strangers on my back, feeling my grandson's small hand slip out of mine as he backed away, frightened by his mother's voice. "I gave up everything," Ishani continued, her voice cracking now, tears mixing with anger in a way that made the words even harder to hear. "To build a life here, a good life, a respectable life, and you keep pulling me backward. You keep dragging the village into my house." I do not remember exactly what I said in response, only that my own voice finally rose to meet hers, something I had not done in all the months since I arrived, all the small compromises I had swallowed silently until this moment. I said something about respect, about the years I had spent teaching hundreds of students, about the language she was calling foreign, being the very language she had been sung to sleep in as a baby. That was when Ishani said the words that would end that evening, and in many ways, end the version of our relationship I had believed we were rebuilding. She stood in that kitchen doorway, in front of her colleagues, in front of her own son, and she said, loudly enough for everyone in the house to hear, "You never should have come to America. Go back to India, and this time, don't come back." The kitchen went completely silent except for the sound of the refrigerator humming, and somewhere behind Ishani, a guest clearing their throat awkwardly. I did not cry in front of her. I want that understood clearly. Whatever else I felt in that moment, and I felt as though the floor itself had dropped away beneath me, I did not give her the satisfaction of watching me break. I simply nodded once, turned off the stove, removed my apron, and walked past her stunned guests, past my grandson standing frozen in the hallway with tears already forming in his eyes, and went to my room, where I closed the door quietly and sat on the edge of my bed in the dark for a very long time. I did not sleep that night. I lay awake listening to the sounds of the party dissolving downstairs, guests making their excuses and leaving early, Arjun's low voice speaking to Ishani in tones I couldn't make out, and finally, near midnight, complete silence settling over the house like a shroud. By the time the first gray light of morning touched my window, I had already made my decision. I rose quietly, packed the same 2 suitcases I had arrived with less than a year earlier, and sat down at the small desk in my room to write a letter, not out of anger, though anger was certainly present, but because I needed my daughter to understand, in words she could read and reread, exactly why I was leaving before she woke. I did not know. As I sealed that letter and carried my suitcases down the stairs in the pale early light, that it would be nearly 8 months before I heard my daughter's voice again, and that when I finally did, everything about our situation would have changed in ways I never could have imagined. The letter I left on the kitchen table that morning was short. I did not write it in anger, though I had every right to. I wrote it the way I might have once corrected a student's essay, clearly, without cruelty, but without softening the truth either. I told Ishani that I loved her, that I would always love her, and that nothing that had happened would ever change the fact that she was my daughter. But I told her that a home where I had to shrink myself daily to be tolerated was not a home at all, and that I refused to spend whatever years I had left apologizing for my own language, my own clothes, my own history. I told her I was returning to India, and that I did not expect her to understand right away, but that I hoped someday she would. I did not say goodbye to Arav. That was the hardest part of leaving. Harder even than the words Ishani had said to me the night before. I stood outside his bedroom door for a long moment before I left, listening to his soft breathing, and I nearly went in to kiss his forehead one last time. But I knew if I saw his face, I would lose whatever resolve I had gathered overnight. So I simply pressed my palm flat against his closed door, whispered a blessing in Canada that only I would ever hear, and walked away. I used what remained of my savings to book a flight home. It was less money than I had hoped, since so much of what I once had went toward the process of moving to America in the first place, toward gifts for the family, toward small contributions to household expenses I had insisted on making despite Ishani's protests. But it was enough. The flight back to India felt endless in a way the flight to America never had. Where before I had traveled with hope, pressing against my ribs like something alive, now I traveled with something heavier, something that felt less like grief and more like the slow, cold settling of a truth I hadn't wanted to face. That love, even a mother's love for her child, is not always enough to protect you from being hurt by the person you love most. I did not go back to my old house, of course. I had sold it. Instead, I stayed with Lakshmi, my old friend, who took me in without a single question, simply opening her door and her arms the moment she saw my face at her threshold. For the first few weeks, I barely spoke. I slept more than I ever had in my life. I sat on Lakshmi's small veranda in the evenings and watched the neighborhood children play cricket in the street. And I let myself feel, fully and without apology, the particular grief of a mother who has been told by her own child that she is not welcome. But grief, I have learned twice now in my life, is not a permanent residence. It is a place you visit, sometimes for a long while, but eventually you find your way to the door and step back outside. For me, that door was a small government school on the outskirts of Mysuru, where children from families with very little money studied in overcrowded classrooms, with teachers stretched far too thin. Lakshmi's niece worked there and mentioned, almost in passing one evening, that they were desperately short of volunteers to help with English lessons for the younger students. Something in me, some old instinct from 30 years of standing in front of classrooms, stirred awake at the mention of it. I began volunteering 3 mornings a week, then 4, then eventually every weekday, sometimes staying late to help students who needed extra attention, sometimes bringing snacks for children I could tell hadn't eaten a proper breakfast. I found, in that small, crumbling schoolroom with its ceiling fans that rattled and its blackboards worn smooth in places, something I had not expected to find again: purpose. I found a version of myself that did not need to shrink to be accepted. The children there did not care what language I dreamed in or what I wore to dinner parties. They cared whether I could help them understand the difference between there and there, whether I would sit with them during lunch and listen to their small worries about exams and friendships and family troubles that mirrored in miniature the same struggles all families carry. Slowly, month by month, I began to feel like myself again, not the self I had been before my husband died, and not the self I had tried to become in Texas, but a third version, forged from everything I had survived. I rented a small apartment near the school with a portion of what remained of my savings. I reconnected with old friends I had let drift during my years of grief and displacement. I even began teaching an evening class in classical Kannada literature to a small group of adult students eager to reconnect with a heritage they felt slipping away in an increasingly English-dominated world. I built, in other words, a life, a small one, an ordinary one by most measures, but one that was entirely, unapologetically mine. Then, exactly 8 months after I had walked out of that house in Texas before dawn, my phone rang. I was sitting at my small kitchen table grading a stack of essays from my evening class when I saw Ishani's name appear on the screen. My hand hovered over the phone for a long moment. Some part of me, the part that would always be a mother first, wanted desperately to answer, to hear her voice, to know that she was safe. But another part of me, the part that had spent 8 months carefully rebuilding a self-respect that had been worn down to almost nothing, held back. I let it ring. I let it go to voicemail. The next day, 5 more calls came, spaced throughout the morning and afternoon, each one unanswered. Then the messages began. Long voice notes, some of them interrupted by what sounded unmistakably like crying. though I made myself listen only to the first few seconds of each before setting the phone face down on the table, unwilling yet to hear whatever it was she needed to tell me. I assumed at first that this was simply guilt catching up with her, that enough time had passed for the shame of what she'd said in front of her colleagues, in front of her own son, to finally settle fully into her conscience. I told myself I was not obligated to soothe that guilt simply because she had finally located it within herself. For 8 months, I had lived without a single word from her, had not been permitted even a phone call with my own grandson, and I was not prepared to simply drop everything the moment it became convenient for her to reach out. But something in the frequency of the calls, in the raw, ragged quality of the voice notes I allowed myself to hear fragments of, told me this was different from simple guilt. There was a note of genuine panic running underneath her voice, something closer to desperation than remorse. It would be another 2 weeks before I finally learned, through a phone call I received not from Ishani, but from Arjun, what had actually happened in the 8 months since I left that house in Texas. Arjun told me, in a voice heavy with exhaustion, that not long after I departed, the careful, polished life Ishani had built had begun quietly unraveling. A colleague, one of the very people Ishani had been so desperate to impress, had come forward with allegations involving her manager, allegations that eventually implicated details about business dealings Arjun himself had unknowingly been connected to through a shared investment. The resulting fallout had strained their marriage nearly to breaking point, as suspicion and blame passed back and forth between them during months of stress neither had anticipated. And now, Arjun told me, his voice dropping even lower, they were facing a legal dispute over custody of Arav, one that hinged on details from a period of time, the very months I had lived in that house, that only I could verify. Only my testimony, my memory of certain evenings and certain conversations I had witnessed, could establish the truth that would protect my grandson's future. Ishani, Arjun said quietly, was too ashamed to explain any of this to me directly. She didn't know how to call her own mother, whom she had thrown out of her home, and ask for help without addressing everything that had happened first. So she had simply been calling again and again, unable to find the words, hoping perhaps that hearing my voice might give her the courage to say what she actually needed to say. I sat with the phone in my lap for a long time after that call ended, looking out at the small garden Lakshmi's niece had helped me plant outside my apartment window, thinking about the strange, circular nature of love and pride and the things we say to each other when we are frightened. The daughter who had once told me never to come back to America now needed, more than anything, for me to answer her call. And I understood, in that moment, that whatever I decided next would determine not just the shape of the rest of my own life, but quite possibly the future of a 5-year-old boy who had once run toward me at a school bus stop, calling out Aji with his whole small heart before any of this had happened to any of us at all.